All right, so I am glad that everyone could be here. And so I'll just tell you briefly. So I'm in the sociology department at the University of Illinois. And where I've been for a number of years. And I work in the area of, my interests are in political polarization and largely communication across ideological differences. And so sometimes when I say political polarization, people think about things like, arguing about the presidential election over the water cooler at work and sort of who you voted for and that kind of thing. And that's not really, I guess that's sort of a piece of it, but my concerns are much more about the way we have conversations about sensitive socio-political issues and the way we talk and think about issues around race and identity and intent and all of those things. And so I teach a course at the University of Illinois. I've taught it twice now, and I'll teach it again next year, called Bigots and Snowflakes. And so that class is, that's sort of a 15-week version of, so I'm taking a little piece of that I'll be talking about today. And then I also, I can let Andrew know this later this summer, but I also have there'll be a series of short videos that I'm doing through the U of I on a lot of these topics as well. And so those, because everything has sort of been shut down for a while, it's taking longer than I expected, but I hope to have those done by the end of the summer. So those will be not obviously behind a paywall or anything. You don't need a University of Illinois affiliation. They'll just be free and available for everybody. So, in terms of going forward, again, those are not ready now, but those will be, I'm hoping by the end of the summer, again, depending on when our stay-at-home order lifts, if it actually does lift at the end of May here. So I'm going to go through the slides and then, as Andrew said, leave some time for discussion, which I think is really the most important part of kind of what we're doing here. And as for discussion, I think we're small enough that people, you can do however you want. You can put questions in chat. You can just raise your hand in Zoom if that's enabled. Is that enabled here, Andrew?
Yeah, they can type in chat.
Well, can they raise their hands too, or no?
Yes, they should be able to.
Okay, all right. Well, however you want to do it is fine. All right, so I'm going to get started. And I'm also, if I'm saying something, and again, we're not a huge group, so if I'm saying something and it just doesn't make any sense, or you don't know you're not sure what I'm getting at, I'm happy to have you interrupt and ask questions while I'm in the middle as well. So if you have something that you feel like it's something that needs to be clarified or something, a concern or whatever, as we're going through, feel free to just jump in the middle. All right.
Sounds great. Thank you.
Yeah. So, and just, I guess I'll say just up front that, so I became aware of your organization through Molly, who I've talked to, and I've talked to Andrew before, but, I think what you guys are trying to do here is great. So I'm happy to have the chance to talk to you and support what you're doing, and hopefully you'll find some of what I have to say useful. But I guess I hope that this is the start of other conversations that you will have going forward with other people, with me, whatever your interactions look like. Okay, so this distinction, this is where I'm going to start, is this distinction between facts and beliefs. And a lot of what I talk about in my work and in class are different worldviews that people have. And one of the things that people will think about sometimes when I talk about facts and beliefs and a distinction, and this is why I have this, this first part here, climate change, is they'll say, well, this is sort of the classic, facts versus beliefs. This is the classic denial of climate change science. And that sort of fits with what I'm talking about, but it's not exactly the same thing. And the reason that it's not exactly the same is because in climate change, you have, yes, there are people who sort of, are more or less on board with what the science seems to show in terms of anthropogenic climate change, but it's more, there's really almost, if not entire consensus, there's something very close to consensus among the scientific community on that question. And so that's almost relative to the things that I'm talking about. The climate change question is almost quote unquote, quote, easy. And so I just wanted to point that out because that's, I think, a lot of times what people will think about. And so when I'm talking about worldviews, I'm talking about how you understand the world, how you interpret interactions, social interactions, particularly when they touch on sensitive issues around identity groups. And when I talk about identity in my work, I'm usually talking about the way people traditionally think about identity now, which is along the lines of race, ethnicity, gender, gender expression, gender identity, sexual orientation, could be immigrant status, but that list of the ways that people commonly think about identity. And so those tend to be obviously most sensitive. And so a couple of points to start out with, our worldviews, how we understand the world those worldviews are being continually reshaped by what we see, by the people we interact with, by what happens in the news. We don't always recognize those things because we each have our own filter. We each have our own, you can almost think of it as a pair of sunglasses that you put on, and that we each have our own pair of sunglasses that we use to see the world. And we sort of forget that we have them on, but we do have them on. And I'll give you a good example of how that works. But we like to think that our filters are informed only by facts, right? Nobody really thinks that they are not informed by facts. Or I mean, maybe not nobody, but the vast majority of us think that we are making empirically based, evidence-based decisions, and that how we understand the world is informed by facts. The reality is that our beliefs play a role too, and that I think, and the point that I'm trying to make here is that the costs of not paying attention to those beliefs is actually a lot higher than we think it is. So this Stanford Law Review study, which I'll reference briefly, so this is in 2012, the study was called They Saw a Protest. And so essentially what that is researchers, if any of you have ever seen it, it's a long article, but you could just look at the introduction and the conclusion and get the gist of it. But it was published in 2012. And in that study, researchers showed an identical video of a political demonstration to people with different worldviews. And so the way they measure worldviews in that study is they said subjects varied on their attitudes towards egalitarianism and hierarchies and individualism versus communitarianism. Those details are less important. What the important part is that they had people with very different sort of orientations in terms of how they understood the world. So they showed the same video to all subjects, but some subjects were told that the demonstrators, so it was a video of a protest, and some subjects were told that the demonstrators were anti-abortion protesters, while others were told that the protesters were part of a group that supported openly LGBTQ members in the military. And so the subjects in the study were then asked to weigh in on whether the demonstrators had crossed the line from protest to what's called prohibited conduct, or whether they'd engaged in lawful speech. And so, again, I'm summarizing a very detailed study, but the results showed that who saw what depended on the relationship between the demonstrators' causes and the subject's own value. So when they were asked to sit as jurors and say, did they cross the line into prohibited conduct, or were they simply exercising their rights to assembly and their rights to free speech, those evaluations changed based on what they thought the people were demonstrating about and how those causes aligned or didn't align with their own personal understanding of the world. So these things matter, right? They shape what we see and how we understand interactions. So the problem is that separating these facts from beliefs requires something that we don't often have a lot of. And I'm happy to throw myself in this bucket with everybody else. And that's humility. And it's not humility in the sense of, I understand I'm not ranked #1 in my class, or I'm not the fastest runner, or I can't, whatever it is, I can't solve a Rubik's Cube the fastest, or whatever it is. It's not humility in that sense. It's humility in the sense of the things that I think that I know, I don't know how sure I am. It's a willingness to be wrong about some pretty deeply held intuitions about the world. And so that humility turns out to be a lot harder than just admitting that you're not the fastest runner or whatever. And so that's the special type of humility. So why does this matter? So what happens when we don't make this distinction between facts and beliefs. So when we don't recognize the assumptions that sort of sit underneath that are the foundation for our worldviews. So just like in that study, in that particular study, it was egalitarianism and hierarchies and individualism versus communitarianism. But what happens when we don't recognize these things? And so the really sort of pernicious effect here is that if we don't make a distinction between facts and beliefs, we don't leave any room for other people to have a different set of beliefs. And so this speaks directly to, I think, what your organization is trying to promote in terms of civil discourse. It is almost impossible to have constructive dialogue if you don't allow for the fact that somebody else is going to understand the world differently. And so that in turn limits our ability to solve problems. It's also a recipe for extremism, which is actually one of the videos that I taught that will hopefully be done by the end of the summer. I'll talk more about that in there. But what ends up happening is that if you don't make this distinction between facts and beliefs, somebody who sees something differently is not just somebody who disagrees with you. There's somebody, right? In other words, if you think that your beliefs are in fact facts, the person who disagrees with you is not just somebody who disagrees with you, there's somebody who's now denying reality, right? And those stakes are a lot higher. Because now, again, you're not talking about just a disagreement anymore. You're saying, well, my opinion is based on what's real, and you're just denying it. And that's a very hard place to get out of. And it's a very hard way to have a conversation about controversial topics. And so where do you go from there if the goal is civil discourse? And I think the answer is that it's really hard to go anywhere from there. So just quickly on the point about extremism, if you and I disagree and you treat my viewpoint as illegitimate, because again, this facts versus beliefs distinction, if we're not making that distinction, you're not making that distinction in this case, you treat my viewpoint as illegitimate, you're probably not going to change my mind. I mean, I guess there's a small chance you will, but probably not. Most people don't change their minds that way. But you might push me further to an extreme. And that push towards extremism has to do with the often heavy social penalties that are placed on, and I'm happy to go into more of this afterwards, that are placed on certain ideas or certain positions. There are reasons, I don't want to oversimplify, there are reasons why there are social penalties for some of these things, but when I think the question that's raised is what happens when those are applied too broadly. And so again, our disagreement, you treating my viewpoint as illegitimate, not going to change my mind. Good chance it's going to push me to take a more extreme position, and we can talk about how that works sometimes. So here's some examples. So these facts versus beliefs questions. So what am I talking about? And so here, this is not a magical list of 4 questions. These are just 4 questions that I came up with to try and illustrate the point that I'm making. And so I'll just read through them. So one is, what % of adult white Americans do you think are racist? What % of men do you think would commit sexual assault if they thought they could get away with it? To what extent is the sorting of men and women into different occupations due to gender roles and discrimination? Are members of minority groups significantly better off than they were 50 years ago? So these questions are, so I'm raising these in the hopes that you'll see that these are questions that don't really have empirical answers. In principle, some of them could be answerable with the right survey data, but that becomes problematic on its own because that would require agreeing on what the terms are. And so we don't have an agreement right now on, for instance, what racism is, or what sexual assault is, or what discrimination is, or what we mean by better off. Right? So if you don't have consensus on those terms, it's not clear how you're going to measure them. And what you think the answers to these questions are, whatever your intuition is, that then is reflected in how you, and I'll give you a couple of examples of this in a minute, in how you interpret different events and different interactions. So again, there is nothing magical about these 4 questions. It's not like these are the holy grail of what makes up somebody's worldview. But this is just, and these are examples to give you an idea of what I'm getting at here. So do these have answers? They don't really. So my point is probably, so the first two questions here, what % of adult white Americans do you think are racist? Or what % of men do you think would commit sexual assault if they thought they could get away with it? Probably neither. Most people would agree that those answers are neither 0 nor 100%, right? With respect to the sexual assault or with respect to the racism question. Most people are not going to say 0 and they're not going to say 100%. There is, beyond that, there's not a lot of agreement on where we land in between. And again, part of that is because we don't agree on the terms. And so we're not talking about the same thing. With respect to the other two questions, so to what extent is the sorting of men and women in different occupations due to gender roles? Are members of minority groups significantly better off than 50 years ago? You know, also no consensus on what the terms mean. So that's just what I was saying a minute ago. So these questions, if we treat them as though they have factual answers, that's problematic because they don't, right? They are based on our deeply held intuitions. They're based on personal experience. They're based on what we see around us. And they are pieces of, again, this worldview, these sunglasses that we're wearing. But facts are not really what they are. They don't have factual answers. Okay, so a couple of examples here that hopefully will make this clear. So in a class that I taught last semester, actually, sorry, the spring semester is over, so this would have been last fall. So this was a class I taught last fall. It was not the Bigots and Snowflakes class, but this was a class in social problems, which touches on a lot of the same themes. And so the students had wanted to have a conversation about policing in minority communities. And this is not, you know, I don't have any background in law enforcement, and it's not something I could speak on from any sort of first person experience. And so I contacted someone at the local police department. I had a lieutenant come in and talk to the class. It was a woman who was about, I don't know, she was probably in her, I don't know, late 50s or early 60s, and she came to talk to the class. And she was a lieutenant in the University of Illinois police force, but her experience was not just local to the University of Illinois. Like, I think she had done a bunch of consulting for the FBI. And so she wasn't just sort of her experience wasn't just narrowly within the confines of the University of Illinois Police Department. So I had her come in, and she was very willing to talk about her experience and very willing to answer questions, pretty much whatever the students wanted to ask. And the class was just under an hour. And at the end of the class, there was one student who she identified, and she would identify herself this way in class, as Afro-Latina. And she said to the police officer, who was a white woman, and however old, again, my guess was her age was late 50s, early 60s. But the student asked her, and she said, "Why should we trust you?" Where in this case, you meant law enforcement and we meant members of minority communities. And the lieutenant said, because things have gotten a lot better over the years. And the student responded and said, you know, she was sort of like, better? How is the current state of affairs better? How is this better? And so the two of them, to me, the two of them were not, you know, if you go back to this question up here, are members of minority groups significantly better off than they were 50 years ago? I would say that the two of them had pretty different answers to that questions. And so one way to think about this, and we ended up talking about this in the class the next time that we met, fair-minded people could disagree on how common it is that police use excessive force, right? Is it, you know, what percentage of the time does this happen? It's right. So fair-minded people could disagree about what that frequency is. And so the lieutenant might have placed the overall frequency lower than the student would have. The lieutenant might have in mind progress in recent decades. She might be thinking of, you know, the vigilance that she sees or vigilance and care that she sees in her colleagues on the police force. I'm just guessing, right? I'm just spouting. And the student for her part, I'm also going to put words in her mouth here, but she might have had in mind the tragic loss of life that spawned the Black Lives Matter movement, right? So that's what she might have in the back of her mind when she said, better, how can you possibly think this is better? So it's not clear. So they would both have very different answers to that question. Not necessarily right or wrong, but certainly different in a way that would make a conversation difficult. So that's with respect to that last question. The other example that I'll give you before, as we come to an end here for discussion, if you think about that, one of the first, I think it was the first question, what about the percent of white adult Americans who are racist? You could ask the question in terms of how these things are applied. How would that be reflected in my opinion on somebody who favors less immigration or greater border restrictions, right? So somebody who is in support of immigration restrictions. If I am someone who thinks that the answer to this question is, I don't know, I'm going to make up a number, 70% or 90% or whatever it is. If I think that the answer is up closer towards, up towards a higher number, I want to say closer to 100, even though probably no one would actually say it's 100, although maybe they would, then I'm much more likely, that person that I encounter who favors less immigration, who wants more border restrictions, I'm much more likely to assume that that person just wants fewer Black and brown people in this country. After all, my prior is that 70%, 80% or whatever of white adult Americans are racist. And so it stands to reason based on that intuition that this person who is opposed to more relaxed, favoring greater immigration restrictions, that they're doing it because of racial motivations. If I think that the answer to that question, this question here from the previous slide, if I think that that is more like, again, I'm just throwing out numbers, 10%, 15%, 5%, whatever it is, but somewhere on the lower tail of the distribution or the left tail of the distribution, I might also question whether the person was racially motivated for saying that, but I'm also much more likely to allow for the fact that maybe they have some other, maybe they're racist, maybe it's just pure racial animus, but maybe it's that they are concerned about national unity, or maybe they are concerned about economic consequences, or maybe they have some other concern that I'm not accounting for that isn't actually driven by racial animus or racial hostility. So you can see hopefully you can see, and you'll have a chance to weigh in a minute, how those things link. This is blank. And so I'm coming to the end here. So it is not realistic, I would argue, and I think this is a fairly uncontroversial point. It is neither realistic nor desirable to think that everyone will share a single viewpoint. And in fact, if everybody did, it would be a very boring world. And so if we accept that, then the distinction between facts and beliefs becomes critical. So, and again, this distinction requires the humility to challenge what it is that we think we know. And so one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking with students about over the course of the semester, and in fact, in one of their final reflective papers, I had a student say, he was a student who had really enjoyed the class, and he was a very active participant. And one of the things he said in his final reflective paper was, I feel like the semester taught me how little I know. And I was like, great, that's a win. But that humility about how do we really know? How do you really know someone's intentions? How do you know what someone means? How do you know, how can you be so sure about those things? So I think that's a different type of humility that most of us don't get to practice very often. And so how do you do this, right? So some concrete ways of thinking about this: stay open, stay curious, ask questions without judgment. Again, this is not something that comes naturally for many of us, but it is necessary for moving forward. And again, I would emphasize that the costs of not doing this are pretty high in a way that I think that we underestimate a lot of the time. All right, so I'm going to stop here. I'm happy to continue talking, answer questions. So I will open up the floor.
Would you say that the internet has done has been a major factor in people going towards more extreme ideologies? Like, being on social media has given more avenues for people that already had these extreme ideas to then push it out further, and then more people gravitate towards those things, or something like that?
You know, it's an interesting question because I think that they, you know, and there's certainly been a lot of written on this. I think the internet has a huge effect. Although, you know, it's all sort of a perfect storm. You've got so many moving parts, but I mean, you know, if you take, then there's different ways of thinking about that. I mean, there's sort of the obvious, almost direct pull towards extremism, which is, you know, what people have written about, you know, YouTube algorithms, that you start on one thing and then you follow the breadcrumbs and suddenly you're in some extremist video supporting something that you know, 3 hours earlier you never would have gotten behind. And so there's that piece of it. And then there's the silo effect, right, of just who you follow and who you follow and who you're paying attention to, and that there's a reinforcing effect there. I also think that there's a flattening effect. So there's a flattening effect in the sense of, and I'm probably not the first person to point this out, but there's a flattening effect in the sense that, you know, anyone really can, to a certain extent. You don't have to be credentialed to have a significant following on Twitter or whatever the social media platform is. So there doesn't have to be anyone can be an expert. You don't have to be you don't have to be making any real intellectual contribution at all, or even having particularly well thought out opinions. But you're given the same weight as somebody who does have those things. And so that's both a good thing. I mean, at some level, it's a great equalizer, but it's also, you know, you also run the risk of weighting all opinions equally that shouldn't necessarily be weighted equally. 4chan and 8chan are an echo chamber for extremism because its community is so niche and closed off. Yeah, I mean, you all probably know a lot. I mean, I'm obviously familiar with those to a certain extent. I've never been on them, and I know that they have had, you know, they've faced huge questions about, you know, First Amendment free speech stuff, you know, in the face of violent extremism and things like that, and I think there are real questions there about how do you know, what's the right thing to do? Are you better off shutting them down? Would you rather have people who are going to, you know, hold those views? Do you want to be able to see and know who they are and you know, not push them into hiding even further? I don't know what the right, I don't know what the right call is. Molly, you had your hand up for a while. So go ahead.
I'm wondering, would you say the emotional side of facts versus beliefs is significant? For example, is the main problem that people do not understand the difference between facts and beliefs, or that they understand, but it just makes them feel angry or upset when someone else has a different opinion and they can't get past that?
I think they don't think that they're beliefs. My experience is that more often than not, people are not generally willing to recognize that they're beliefs, and I think it comes from a place of wanting to protect people and wanting to protect particularly, you know, oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes, by Grace, members of marginalized groups. And so I think, and I see this, I don't think it's just like, this is not like a kid problem. It's not like this is, you know, all on your generation. This goes up through instructors at the university level. This is up and down the age distribution. So I do think, I mean, I think it's sort of that people, I think it's a lot of it is that people don't really know. And I mean, I think that's an open question, Molly, about, you know, well, if they knew, would they do things differently? I don't know. I think there's a lot of resistance. I think there's an enormous amount of resistance to the kind of humility that I'm suggesting, because no one wants to hear it, right? People don't like to hear these things. So Kevin, shouldn't it in theory be the other way around? If we allow all ideas to be explored freely and let good ideas stand on their ground, why do some bad ideas flourish on the internet? So this is the idea. You didn't use these words, but what Kevin, it sounds like, is saying is the marketplace of ideas. And so this is the concept that, you know, ideas should rise and fall on their merits alone, and that they should all get an airing. And so, but it sounds like, I don't know, Kevin, if you're still here, it sounds like you're saying, well, if that's true, if the marketplace of ideas really works, then why are there some bad ideas that flourish? Is that the question?
That's correct.
Yeah. You know, That's a good question. So if the market, I mean, so if the marketplace of ideas works, then, I mean, so, you know, one question would be, you know, well, maybe it does work. And maybe, well, so, okay, a couple of things. One, maybe it doesn't work. Two, maybe it does work and we have the wrong time horizon, right? So maybe it's just, maybe it is working, and that's, and the other thing, I guess, would be, the other point that I guess someone could make would be, you know, when you have these social penalties, it's hard to let the marketplace of ideas do its thing and sort of sort itself out when you have very high social, like, so for instance, here's a concrete example. So let's say, so, you know, and I'll use this example because everyone will know what it is. But take an example like affirmative action. So if you say that the position, if I take a position against affirmative action, and I say, you know, I just say I'm opposed to affirmative action. I think we should do away with it. I think it should be gone. You don't know, and I don't mean this just to Kevin, just in general, like somebody, if I take that position, you can't tell if I'm taking that. And this is sort of similar to the immigration point that I was making earlier. It's similar to the immigration example in the sense that you don't know if I'm taking that position because I am coming from a real place of racial hostility, right? And I don't want members of underrepresented groups to benefit from these. I don't want the people who are going to benefit from these programs to actually receive those benefits for whatever, because of resentment or hostility or whatever. You don't know if that could be my reasoning. I could also be opposed to affirmative action because I think that I think it doesn't help the people that it's designed to help. I think actually the costs are worse than I think the costs are too high and the benefits are too low. And there are, you know, there's all kinds of arguments about that. The problem is, and so one is a principled argument and the other is sort of an argument that's driven from a place of racial animus. And the problem is that you can't tell what my motivations are, short of sort of peeling back my head and, you know, and really being able to see into my skull and figure out why it is that I'm taking the position that I'm taking. And making it even more complicated, my incentive is, if I'm coming from a place of racial hostility, my incentive is to convince you that I'm not, right? Like, so again, just with that affirmative action example. So I'm trying to think about how I got on this tangent about why do bad ideas flourish on the internet. Oh, so this idea of social penalties, I think, makes it hard for the marketplace of ideas to work. But I also think, you know, I don't think we have a real sense as to how well it would work. I think we would probably need to give it a better chance than it has. And then think about what the time horizon is, you know, and there's always going to be bad ideas. I mean, they're just, you know, all opinions should not be given equal weight. I don't think that's ever the case. Do you think that concepts such as culture and identity fall into issues such as political polarization and division? Personally, I do. Yes. And I mean, I'm talking about my own views here. I think identity and culture play an enormous role. I think particularly how we think about identity. I mean, I think that there are assumptions that people don't talk about how we think about identity that matter, right? Like, who says that we have to think about identity this way, right? Like, so for instance, going back to the way identity along the dimensions that I talked about in the beginning, it is certainly the case that many people do think about their identity that way, right? It is not the case that everybody does. And the alternative being something like, let's say, instead of thinking about identity along the lines of race, gender, and the list that I gave at the beginning, let's say that I think about identity in terms of my interests, right? Like, I don't think about my self-concept is less tied to my race, my gender, whatever. And it's more, I'm just saying this as an example, and it's more tied to, you know, the fact that I love Star Wars and I write poetry. Again, I'm just making this up, but there are different ways to think about. So going back to Brandon's question about identity, and I guess culture and identity sort of go hand in hand, but I personally, I think they have an enormous bearing on these issues. Often people tend to turn to extremist beliefs when their economic situation turns dire. Do you think we'll see this issue on an even larger scale if we spiral into a recession, depression? You know, that is, I don't have a crystal ball. From what I read, from what I understand, from what I see, to the extent that this exacerbates, I mean, I guess here's my concern. To the extent that the current conditions exacerbate existing inequality, I think that we were already doing a pretty miserable job of talking about inequality in this country. And that could be any kind of inequality, whether it's income inequality, wealth inequality, health, educational attainment, test scores, college admissions, whatever, pick your metric and all of it. I think we do a pretty poor job of talking about inequality in general. And so to the extent that the aftermath and during the pandemic exacerbates the existing inequalities that we were already not doing a particularly good job of talking about, I think that is enormously concerning. Right, and again, we could go into more detail about that, but yeah, so I guess yes, I do think that I think it's concerning on a larger scale. What's your opinion on the status of free speech in college campuses? Across history, student organizations are known to grow into extremism or movements, i.e. the counterculture movement in the 1960s. It's interesting. So free speech, and this is sort of the free speech, disinvitations, no platforming, all of that. My sense is, and a lot of that has quieted down in the last couple of years, setting aside COVID-19, a lot of that has quieted down in the last couple of years, and there are competing beliefs about why that's quieted down. So some people will say that that's quieted down because, people have lost interest or whatever. Other people will say that that's quieted down because the people who were inviting controversial speakers, they gave up. And so they just said, you know what, forget it. It's too much of a headache. It's too risky. It's too expensive, whatever. We're just not going to do it. And obviously those reasons have different implications. My other thought on that is that my personal position is that the focus on, and if anyone's interested in this, I wrote a paper on this for a conference last fall, but the focus on things like how many speakers were deplatformed or how many, free speech violations were there was the First Amendment. I don't know what people know about the First Amendment, but it covers public institutions and not private institutions, although private institutions almost always voluntarily comply with the First Amendment as well. But my sense is that the focus on these things is a little bit of a distraction. I think that we like to focus on things that we can count. And so to the extent we can count, Heather McDonald and Ann Coulter and Ben Shapiro and whoever else, you throw on this list was disinvited and deplatformed and, and whatever. And there was this free speech violation or that. Those things are important, but I do think that they are, to a certain extent, I think they're a distraction in the sense that one of the arguments that I've tried to make is that I think that in higher education, and I know some of you are going off to college, I think, and this is what's in the paper that I wrote, which is freely available, is that if you have a classroom, so for instance, even in my own field of sociology, that for a lot of what's taught, and not without exception, but by and large, that for a lot of what's taught, there is a problem in terms of ideology and in terms of political polarization, even if you have not a single student who's complaining. And so that's why I would say that the focus on, that an exclusive focus on free speech, disinvitations, no platforming, all of that stuff is a distraction, is because I think there's a problem even if there's no one complaining. And so I don't, I could go into more, I go into that a lot more in the paper. If anyone wants to read it, I can send Andrew the link. Again, that's just freely available. So Molly said, I referenced that amendment all the time as a little kid. My parents had to tell me that things weren't First Amendment issues. Right. So yes, I don't know how well that would go over trying to use that argument with your parents. The internet is often called out for creating ideological echo chambers and that they often lead to radicalization. What's your opinion? Yes, I will send, I'm not going to be fast enough here to pull up the link right now, but Andrew, if I send it to you, will you post it or?
Yeah, definitely. We're going to see if we can find ways to distribute this recording as well.
It's also, I'll just say, and I'm going to get to Stephen's question here in a second, but it's also the case that on my business website, so the consulting website, all of this stuff, it's posted. Sorry, my cat just jumped on the table. It is that paper is posted on there as well. I'll send Andrew the direct link, but that paper is, the website is, so let me just put this here. Hold on. Hope I got that right. So on that website, on that website, under, I think it's under Who We Are, which is really just me, are links to all of my public facing writing, including, but the one that you might be particularly interested in is that FIRE paper, and the FIRE stands for the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and so it was a paper from last fall, but I'll also email the direct link to Andrew afterward. Okay, so sorry, Stephen's question. The internet is often called out for creating ideological echo chambers and that they often lead to radicalization. So what's your opinion on the university campus safe spaces for different races, cultures, identities, and ideologies possibly creating the same issue? So my sense is that I don't want to minimize how important those spaces have been for people. I think that they are, to the extent that they have real benefits, I don't want to minimize that. I do think that I think that this is true for institutions of higher education. I think it's also true for corporations, which is, what I try and do in my sort of non-academic facing work. I don't think that you can build community when you are constantly, when the only message that's being telegraphed is that you're telling people that they're different. And so I think it's self-reinforcing. I can give you a quick example. So when I was, this was also last fall, when I was teaching the same class actually where the lieutenant came to class, there was that class, so that was a social problems class, and it was, it tends to be, it's a 100 level class in sociology. It tends to be very racially and ethnically diverse. The gender balance is it's not particularly well balanced. It is more women than men, but there are certainly some men that were in the class, but racially and ethnically, it's very diverse. In that class one time, there were students who were talking about, their experiences with racism. And so I'm going to circle back to the point that Stephen's question raised. So there were students talking about their experiences with racism. So for instance, one student said something like, I'm trying to remember what they said. So one student said she was talking about her experience where someone had told her, you're pretty for a Black girl. Or another student was talking about, she was talking about how she'd been on the dance team in high school. She was also Black, and so she was talking about how she'd been on the dance team in high school, and someone had said, oh right, I'm trying to remember this. She said that her team they were voting for superlatives at the end of the year, and so she was voted, and I think she might have been the only Black young woman on the team, and she said that she was nominated for best hip hop. And she was sort of like, why am I getting nominated for best hip hop? Hip hop's not my thing, whatever. And so it was because of her race. And so anyway, my point is that students were talking about this, and it was, I think it was a really important chance for the students who were sharing their experiences to do so. And I think it was also an important chance for students to hear what they had to say. But here's what happened. So there was one student who said, she said that her experience with racism, so this student she was of some, I don't know exactly what her racial and ethnic background was, but she was maybe perhaps some kind of Latina. And she said that sometimes when she wore her hair sort of pulled into a bun at the nape of her neck, and she wore hoop earrings, she said that people would tell her, and so she said that people would tell her, you're like great job. I don't know how they worded it exactly, but something commenting about how she was doing great keeping it real, like this idea that she was keeping it real. And so I didn't understand, because this was not whatever. This was a vernacular that I wasn't really up to speed on. And so at the time, now I understand that meant that she looked appropriately ethnic when she was wearing her hair in a bun and was wearing the big hoop earrings, and that when she didn't look that way, the idea being that she was trying to look too white. But I didn't understand that at the time. Like when she was telling her, in that moment, when she was telling that story, I was like, okay, someone's gonna have to explain this to me, because I don't know. I don't even know what that means. And so when I said that, my point about in all of this is that when I said that in the class, we had gone from this moment where students were talking about their experiences with racism, and which again was an important experience, but the line in the classroom was by race, right? So the students who were not members of minority groups, they didn't have any stories to tell about and rightly so, they had nothing to share about their own personal experiences with racism, right? And that makes total sense. As soon as I said, I don't understand what keeping it real means, because everyone in the class understood instantly, I don't know how, but they all understood exactly what this young woman meant when she was saying that. And so as soon as I said, I don't know what that means, you can't see me snapping my fingers, but I'm snapping my fingers like that, the divide in the room went from race to age instantly. And so my point was that with the class, as I said, did you see, and I didn't plan it this way, but I just said, did you see what just happened? Like there was this racial line and then it switched to age. Because when it switched to age, I was the one who they all knew what was going on, like what was being talked about. And I was the one who had no idea, which was perfectly fine with me. I'm many years older than there. But that was, and so the question that I posed to the class, and I'm sorry, Stephen, this is a long way to get back to your question. But the question that I posed to the class was, if all you focus on is the race, if all you focus on is the race, then what are you missing? So the question was, what are you missing if you don't allow opportunities? So this is going back to Stephen's question about separating groups and things like that. And so my point is that I don't think it has to be all or nothing, but the concern is that when you only focus on those lines of division, that you miss the sort of transcendent experiences that can link people across groups. And that can be very, dangerous is the word that comes to mind. So I hope that answered your question, Stephen. Linda, my neighbor just wrote a book on First Amendment, saving free speech from itself. Oh, interesting. I have not. Okay, I will have to take a look. I have not seen that book. So yes, there are a number of books around free speech that have come out. Feeling obliged to appeal to your own racial stereotypes is definitely one of the things that stops certain ethnic groups from climbing the social ladder. No, Kevin, do you want to clarify what you're, I don't want to put you on the spot, but if you want to say more about what you had in mind, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts.
I was just sort of relating to the story that you were talking about, because definitely that part about acting too white sort of relates a lot. Like the Hispanic community, that's definitely a big thing. So I just wanted to point that out.
Yeah. No, thank you. Yeah. I mean, I think that, I think these are really, look, there's a reason that this stuff is hard. And that these conversations are hard, and that these issues are tricky. But I think that we collectively, dramatically underestimate the costs of just ignoring these problems, and that we can't sort of communicate about these things. I don't know what a Thane podcast is. I'm sorry. I probably should know what that is, but I don't know. I don't have a podcast, and I don't know who Thane is. Maybe someone will tell me. It's a valid feeling. Yeah. So Kevin put a comment in there as well. So yeah, other questions, thoughts, comments, share your own experiences if you want. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. I know there was one person who said they're going to the U of I. So yes, it would be great to have you in class.
I'm going to soon apply next year.
Uh-huh.
So what other courses do you offer?
Me, I teach, so some of what I teach is not as interesting. I teach an introductory statistics class, which is, some people are not excited about statistics. I teach a social research methods class as well, but the two classes that are really where I really get into this stuff, I mean, this is sort of woven into my whole, approach to teaching, but the classes where it's most directly relevant are the social problems class, which is going to be offered in the fall of 2020, this fall. And then the bigots and snowflakes class will be offered again in the spring of 2021, and it will probably be offered in subsequent, I don't know when, I think you said next year, but in subsequent spring. So in the spring semester, I'm the only one who teaches that class. And so if there were demand, I would offer it more often. But for right now, I think we're looking at offering it in the spring.
Cool. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, those classes definitely sound interesting to me.
Yeah, well, hopefully. I do what I can. Other thoughts, questions? Yeah, no, thank you for having me. I will send Andrew the link for that paper. If you have, if anything else comes up, whatever, feel free to reach out. I'm very findable. So yes. Thank you, everyone. Thank you,
Thank
Andrew.
you.
Yeah. And I will, if you haven't seen the link on my website, I'll send it to Andrew so it's directly available to you.
Yeah. And before we close out,
Yeah.
we just want to thank you, Ilana Redstone.
Yeah, thank you.
For talking to us and being so informative. And we hope to be able to have some more events with you in the future.
Absolutely, that would be great. And you guys are doing great work. Molly, go ahead before we go.
I just wanted to say thank you so much for hosting this event. It means so much to me and to the YACU as a whole, and I really loved all that you were saying, and will try and use that in my everyday life because, I must confess that sometimes I have been a little too stick-to-it about ideas and have treated them as facts, and this was really an eye-opener. Thank you so much.
Oh, good. I'm glad. Well, thanks, Molly. All right, everyone. Thank you so much. Andrew, I'll be in touch with that link. And yeah, this doesn't have to be the end. This could be the start of more conversations. So.
Yep,
Yeah.
definitely.
All right,
All right.
take care.